Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasant task to welcome you all to this topical subject, India, the USA, and the voice of the Global South. We could not have found a better panel of such eminent panelists to share their views on this important topic. As you are well aware, Global South has been adversely affected in the last 3 years from the challenges of COVID pandemic, rising prices of fuel, fertilizers, and food grains, and to top it all, also the rising debt burden. My experience as former ambassador and PR to Geneva is that India is still seen as a credible voice of the Global South. And India had also held a virtual summit in early January of the Voice of the Global South, which was virtual. In these challenging times, when India is the president of G20 and you have all the foreign ministers of G20 descending on Delhi, we look forward to hearing the panelists on this important topic. Last but not the least, a housekeeping request. Kindly put your mobiles on silent mode. I now invite IFA President Ambassador Surinder Kumar to give the bouquets to the eminent panelists.
First one you leave out, he's not here.
Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon. Dr. Seshadri Chari.
Yeah, he's very much here. Long live.
Dr.
Repeat Dr. Tharoor's name again.
Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Seshadri Chari. Professor Raja Mohan. And last but not the least, Suhasini Haider.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Now it's yours, Ambassador Surinder Kumar.
Timekeeper, eh? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all. Iska volume kam karo bhai. I'm grateful to all for coming at a time of so many distractions, especially our panelists who have shown up to show solidarity to IFA, even when the G20 Foreign Ministers meeting is taking place in Pragati Maidan. I must recognize just a few persons, His Excellency the Ambassador of Spain. We have a former Chief Army Staff General Deepak Kapoor. We have a well-known Kathak Guru, Dr. Shobhana Narayan. We have a friend from the British High Commission, and all of you, each one of you is important. We couldn't have found a much better, more eminent panelist. Dr. Tharoor needs no introduction, a UN diplomat for 29 years who rose to the rank of Under-Secretary General of the UN, former MOS, EA, and HRD, and three-time MP from Thiruvananthapuram, author of 23 books, including the Sahitya Akademi Award winner, An Era of Darkness, and most recently, biography of Dr. Ambedkar. He's a combative debater and a forceful orator in English. डॉक्टर शशि थरूर जी, जिस तेज़ रफ्तार से आपकी हिंदी में इम्प्रूवमेंट हो रहा है, मुझे लगता है 2024 में आप प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोदी को नहीं तो कम से कम डॉक्टर शेषाद्री चारी को बहुत बड़ी कड़ी टक्कर देने वाले हैं. The former Foreign Secretary and the former NSA Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon. You hear his Hindi, you will be amazed what kind of improvement he has shown. Former Foreign Secretary, former NSA Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon was mentioned not long ago by an international publication as one of the 100 most influential strategic thinkers in the world. He is the only Indian diplomat who has served as Ambassador High Commissioner in 3 very difficult neighbors, Pakistan, China, and Sri Lanka. Both his books, Choices Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy and India and the Asian Geopolitics, are considered as a must-read for the student of international relations. Recently, in an interview with the Foreign Affairs Journal, he has shared his thoughts about the unaligned world between orders. For me, above all, he is a dear friend and batchmate. Dr. Sesadi Chari, the former chief editor of the organizer, is a prominent and respected leader of BJP. He is currently a member of the National Executive Committee of the BJP. We often see him in TV channels on primetime debates, but very few know that he is an expert on China. He is the chairman of the Center of Chinese Studies at MAHE. His articles on various subjects, including strategic affairs, are carried by several publications. He was gracious enough to have contributed an article to the book India at 75, edited by me, which was released in the same hall in August last year. Dr. Tharoor has also graciously contributed an article to this book. Professor Raja Mohan wears several hats, though he prefers to be called a columnist and commentator. Currently a senior fellow of Asia Society Policy Institute, he is a well-known, recognized strategic thinker who writes for the Indian Express and the Foreign Policy magazine. He is credited with several books, including Samudra Manthan, Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence, and recently released edited volume, Grasping India's Greatness. And can you think of it? He achieved all this in spite of the JNU. Suhasini Heather is presently the national diplomatic editor of the Hindu. She has worked with CNN in New York and Delhi, was prime-time anchor of the CNIBN for years. Her show, The World View Suhasini Heather, is considered very informative by many of her fans, while some troll her on the Twitter. Undeterred, she has been covering stories from conflict zones like Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Syria, and she has won many awards, including Prem Bhatia Award and IT Award, and also Haldigati Award. I don't know with Haldigati, the one with Rana Pratap won or the lost. Let me flag a few points about the theme. India's relations has never been better. It is not a cliche. It reflects a lot of truism. Gone are the ghosts of 1960s when every losing political party raised the bogey of CIA hand. Or 1971 when Nixon and Henry Kissinger unsuccessfully tried to intimidate India. Or 1998 when the US imposed some of the severest sanctions on India for carrying out nuclear tests. Both countries have overcome the hesitation of history. The US has signed the Civil Nuclear Agreement, made India a major defense partner, accorded its STA-1 status, which puts her on par with the NATO allies, and for supply of defense equipment. And only last month, NS Ajit Doval, his counterpart Sullivan, agreed in Washington on initiative on critical and emerging technologies, which could be a game changer as it signifies American willingness to share sensitive and dual-use technologies. India has also showed courage in signing LEMOA, Comcasa, BECA, the basic communication agreements, which really deepen the interoperability cooperation between the two armies. US has also shown great understanding, which many of you know what I'm referring to. In 2021-22, India-US trade has touched US dollar 119.42 billion, accounting for 11.5% of India's global trade, and overtaking India-China trade valued at 115.42 billion. Interestingly, while India enjoyed a surplus of 32.79 billion in our trade with the US, it has registered a trade deficit of 72.5 billion with China. And what about could be more heartening news from the USA than an Indian-American Ajay Banga to be named to head the World Bank? There are as many as 5 members of Indian origin in the US Congress and 50 elected state legislators. Long live the Samosa Club. If Nikki Haley gets the Republican nominations, he will be writing history. A word about the voice of Global South. I am not sure who is in, who is out, and why. At one time, we used to have a group called G77 plus China. For decades, we had the largest group of UN members called NAME. Are most of the NAME members a part of Global South? Is Global South a monolith or comprised of dozens of smaller groups formed with different objectives? Is China, world's second largest economy, sitting on a pile of nearly $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, a member of Global South? When Gandhiji was in London to attend the roundtable conference, a journalist asked him, Mr. Gandhi, what about the Western culture? After a pause, Mahatma said, it would be a good idea. Recently, a G20 leader was asked if India should be the voice of Global South. He also paused and quipped, it would be a good idea. And why not? India is the most populated country in the world today. It is the fifth largest economy with $3 trillion economy, which is tipped to touch $5 trillion by 27, according to Dr. Arvind Panagaria of Columbia University. While the world is still struggling to reach the pre-COVID level of growth, India has been hailed as the brightest star by IMF World Bank. It is a world leader in digital transaction, financial inclusion through bank, administered over 2 billion vaccine doses, extended vaccine help to over 160 countries, and can share her experiences in harnessing green energy and climate change. Bill Gates only today in a long interview in Times of India has said that G20 presidency is an opportunity for India to showcase its digital public goods so that other countries can also adopt them. The chief coordinator of India G20 President, Harsh Sangla, expressed similar sentiment in his op-ed in Hindustan Times on 27 February, pointing out that the total debt of the poorest indebted countries has been estimated to be around $9 trillion, and that 60% poorest countries were risk of debt stress. Sangla wrote, at G20 presidency, will focus on these areas. I leave other comment to my all panelists, and I stop here, but before I go, I must thank my friend Subodh Jain of SAGE, who has been one of the founder members of IFI, is always supporting IFA program. I hope you'll find it enjoyable and also meaningful and thought-provoking. Thank you. Now I assume my next duty, and I request Dr. Raja Mohan to enlighten on what we should read about China's role in this G20, but more than that is so-called the Global South. Over to you, Professor Raja Mohan.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumar. It's really, Mr. Kumar doesn't take no for an answer. The problem, I was quite reluctant to be on this very, very distinguished panel.
You are enjoying Jaipur Festival.
But here I am with buyer's remorse, but nevertheless here to make just three broad propositions which might be useful to start a conversation this evening. The first proposition I want to make is about what is the dominant trend in international politics today. Second, what is its impact of this dominant trend on the Global South? Three, how does it intersect with India's relationship with the US and China? So these are the broad 3 points I wanted to make. First, I think, to put it very briefly, the era of multilateralism is over. It sounds like a famous statement, but it is. I can qualify this by saying the era of expansive multilateralism that emerged after 1991, both in the political and economic domain, today is no longer with us. It is because that we have a return of great power rivalry that seemed to dissipate in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. For nearly 30-odd years, we've had the major powers at relative peace with each other, engaged in deep commerce with each other, and there was no major conflict, direct conflict, at least, between the major powers. But both those facts today are no longer obtained, and what you have is actually a real hot war in the center of Europe, where actually, after nearly 75, 80 years of peace, you have actually a shooting war right in the heart of Europe, and quite a brutal war that is unfolding. And perhaps we are not too far from a similar conflict in Asia, if things go bad in Asia as well, between US and China. So therefore, the idea that the world is going to move towards an integrated, shared, collective approach to global problems is over. And what we're going to have is actually a contested multilateralism, a contested domain in which the major powers do not agree on the core issues of the international system. So I think that is the reality, and that it is a reality. We don't like it. It doesn't really going to change anything. We have to deal with the renewal of great power rivalry. This takes me to the second point, which is really, is the return of great power rivalry bad for the global south? But that seems to be the general consensus, that seeing what's happening in food security, energy security, all those issues. But if the rivalry is going to be structural and enduring for a long time, it might be actually, let me say this, beneficial, if you want to put it in a very instrumental way, to the global south, because for 30 years, when there was no contestation between the great powers, there was no real interest in, at least in the West, of engaging, of cultivating the global south. Now, if you go back to the Cold War period, because they were in a deep contest, in a competition all-encompassing ideological, political, military, every little country in the third world mattered. Because either location, value. Similarly today, if this contestation grows deeper, you might have lithium, you might be important. You might be located next to China's periphery, you might be important. If you have something specific to offer in this competition, you will be important. So this idea, and I would say, it's not automatic that renewed great power rivalry is going to be bad for the global south. And I think if we go back to our own experience in the Cold War, quite in the first decade at least, Americans and the Russians were competing to give us more aid, and we managed to get aid from both. So it is not that it is automatically going to be bad, but I think it needs the capacity, the will to play the game, the stomach, even more important, to be able to navigate the great power rivalry, leverage the conflicts in order to advance your own national interests, both economic and security. So those who have the stomach to be able to play this great power game will, I think, in the global south, might actually benefit rather than lose out from the conflict that has reemerged. The third part I wanted to say was really, when we talk about great power rivalry today, it's not an abstract something that's taking place beyond us. Because in the earlier Cold War, US and Russia seemed slightly removed from us. But today the confrontation is between US and China is our neighbor. So this idea that you can actually be neutral between the two when one of them is your neighbor and has a direct effect on your security. And I think the equations, the calculations fundamentally change. And it won't be wrong to say, last few years, there is a Sino-Indian rivalry. There is contestation on the territory, on the nature of regional order, on the nature of multilateralism. So the conflict between India and China is a real one. And the nature of the great power politics in general today, India-China contestation is an important part of it. This is not something separate from it, but it is very much a part of that. So therefore, that exists as a reality, and I think that is going to fundamentally shape the way India is going to deal with the global issues, its own partnerships with other countries, as well as how it deals with the global south. In some senses, you can say the rediscovery of the global south by India is partly driven by the enormous rise in the Chinese profile within our own neighborhood. The expanding Chinese influence, economic, political, and military in the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean have provided the trigger, I think, for us to relook at our own policies and to be able to retain what was historically a central position for India in this part of the world. So in some senses, it's already driven by that. And this idea that we talk about the global south, it is certainly not a return to the past. It's not the 1960s, it's not the 1970s. Today, if you look at the Voice of the Global South Summit, there's not a word against the West. So we're not trying to reorganize a trade union against the West. I would say, actually, to put it very sharply, while in the past it might have been a mobilization of the global south against the West, today we are saying we want to be a bridge between the south and the West. This is very, very different from the traditional notions where and we mobilize the third world against the West, and you are actually in competition with China, which is one of the major powers. So let me come to the more outrageous conclusion, that is, in dealing with the competition with China, we're going to do more and more cooperation with the West. It's already a reality, whether it is the Quad, which is the other forums, our trade, our economic orientation, our people-to-people cooperation, our links today are deepened with the West. India's trade with the US, India's trade with Europe, India's trade with Anglos, we put it all together, that is the dominant part of India's international engagement. Therefore, what you're going to see is that an India that is going to be far more deeply engaged with the West in dealing with the new challenges in the international system, out of which the South is one important part of it. Those of you who've seen Kishida's speech on Global South, for the first time you're seeing a G7 country actually talk about echoing India's argument that the West has neglected the Global South. West has given lectures to us in the last 30 years. What did Trump call shithole countries, right? That they didn't seem to matter, and that all that the West had to do was to give us lectures, preach us human rights, and say, if you don't do this, you're under sanctions. So Kishida is saying, no, you can't do this. If you want to be able to generate political support, which you couldn't do on the Ukraine crisis, you needed to reach out through political engagement, through greater cooperation with the countries of the Global South, and that's the only way you can go forward. So I think for the first time you're seeing, post-1991, a recognition that you can't simply neglect the Global South, you can't simply tell them what to do, or that the West has all the answers. So my sense is, as we look ahead, I think there will be an effort by the West to reconnect with the Global South. And that would be, as I said, more attention, because the last 30 years, the Russians and the Chinese have gained enormous ground because of the Western neglect. But today, I think the West is going to reconnect with this part of the world. We've seen the US reach out to Africa, to Latin America, to South Pacific, and I see that's going to be very much part of the re-engagement. And that, in turn, I think, would help India, that we can emerge as an important force in the Global South in partnership with the West. That is very different from the previous experience, our attempted leadership with the Global South. So let me stop here by simply saying that I would say, look out for G7. Might be more interesting ideas coming from there rather than G20. Thank you.
Very much, Professor Radha Mohan. You have lived to your expectations and given a lot of food for thought. Now I invite Dr. Seshadri Chari to share his thoughts on the Global South and prospects for India, challenges and opportunities.
Thank you, Ambassador Surendra, and my co-panelists on the dais, and friends. Ambassador Surendra, you can make out that he has divided the subject into different parts. And that's what he is saying now. But 90 minutes back he said, you please speak on the subject that I have suggested. So now if I change the subject, another 10 minutes extra I need.
Only 10, whatever way.
So this is domination of the Global South. Actually, I expected my friend Shashi Tharoor to tell us more about the background of Global South and how the colonial abstract has created something called Global South, where it's not exactly geographic, because Global South is no longer a geographic concept. It's more a different way of looking at Global South. But originally the idea was the colonies were all called Global South because they were not developed. If not underdeveloped, they were developing. And of course, it's the white man's burden that these colonies should develop. So the colonies which are supposed to develop were all called Global South. So Africa downwards, you call it the Indian subcontinent, or you call it whatever name that was given different Western scholars at different times. But today that is not the case. global south has acquired certain unique characteristics. I think the most important characteristic, well, here I will slightly disagree with Raja on this multilateralism. Global South has actually acquired these qualities of multilateralism. It's the Global South which is actually representing multilateralism. In fact, if you look at the entire Global South, if you geographically divide also, or if you divide the country-wise also, if you see, the maximum number of multilateral institutions are also in Global South. You call it BIMSTEC or IPSA or ASEAN or any other institution that you look at. Huge number of institutions are in the Global South, as against maybe a NAFTA or a NATO in the North. And the most important idea of Global South has also changed, because the contest for power is no longer based on the number of colonies that you have or the number of the area of geography that you have. That is all gone with 1940s and 50s, or even before that rather. After the end of the Second World War, this whole idea of colonies have been dismantled. So the country which controls the maximum amount of, larger the geography they control, the greater the power, is not the question anymore. Then came a phase where the country's power was determined by the kind of defense force, the army that they have. So whoever can station their army anywhere in the world at the shortest given time was considered to be the most important than the great power. That is not the case now. Today the contest is not between the geographies, it's not between the armies, but the contest is between 23 trillion economy and 15 trillion economy. Who controls the economy? Who presses the economic button is the strength. Therefore, the importance of Global South comes here. Global South is today what is called emerging economies. It's no longer just Global South, it is emerging economies. All the countries in the world put together, all the emerging economies in the world have come together to represent what popularly is called the Global South. And that is where we come to this idea of India leading the voice. When it comes to economically leading the economically developing or emerging economies, that is where India plays a much larger role. Another characteristic of the Global South is what we call the trilateral engagements. India probably has the maximum number of trilateral engagements, like the UK, India, Africa trilateral, France, Morocco, India trilateral, UAE, Ethiopia trilateral. Think of all these trilaterals. Again, India is also playing a leading role as far as bridging the West and the East, or for that matter, the developing economies, emerging economies and the emerged economies, or the Global South and the Global North, through different mechanisms. Call it strategic mechanism or call it security mechanism. Like Quad, for example, India is the link between the four economies, rather, the four strong contenders as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned. So there again, India plays a leading role. And then we know about the trade pact that India has with number of, be it Asia-Africa growth corridor. It is the developed world which requires India even to get into Africa, even to get into some of the Global South countries, some of the emerging economies in the world. It is India which is going to be a hand holder for some of the most developed countries. Like Asia-Africa growth corridor is fully supported by Japan. It is India which is supporting Japan to enter Africa, where they had no role 20 years back, 30 years back. Or if you come to, let us say, supporting India's trade and investments with Africa, CETA, there again, India is playing a leading role in bridging the difference between investments and trade vis-a-vis Africa. So these are all the areas where India is in a way leading. Therefore, from colonies to military, when it comes to a contest between economies, between a contest between 23 trillion economy and 15 trillion economy, it is India which is going to play an important role and be the voice of the emerging economies. We call it Global South for the sake of their title that has been given, but it is actually emerging economies. But yes, it's not that it's going to be an easy bed of roses. We have certain problems. What we see is the major change from rather a socialist economy to a more vibrant market economy. One person who should be given the credit, and Shashi should be happy about this, is none other than Mr. Narasimha Rao, who changed the economic course of the country. Then came a number of prime ministers who effectively changed the course of economy. And today, we have political will to lead the Global South. We have the political will and capability to lead the emerging economies. But do we have the matching economic capability is the question. So we will have to develop that economic capability along with the political will and capability to lead the emerging economies. That's going to be quite a problem, that's going to be a tough issue because it's not just developing one's own economy, it's also developing bilateral and multilateral economic forums and giving them strength. Can we effectively insulate ourselves, say, from being drawn into the vortex of great power rivalry? Can we do that? The great power rivalry is no longer on geographic lines, the great power rivalry is no longer on military lines, the great power rivalry is on economic lines. The economic parameters is what is determining the great power rivalry and the victory or the loss of it. So can we do that? That is going to be a very big challenge as far as India is concerned. We will have to work on it domestically, we will have to work in the region for it, we will have to have a robust institutional framework for South-South cooperation. We don't have an institutional framework as of now. So we will have to have an institutional framework. As we also importantly, we have to have an institutional framework for Indo-Pacific region. If we have that, and if we are able to do that with economic and political parameters, then probably we will be able to really meet the challenge, not only of the Global South, but also bridge between this. And moreover, it's not anymore going to be a divide between the North and South. It is going to be a bridge between North and South, so that there is a robust new economic world order which is inclusive. That is the crossroads at which India is standing, and it's an important area from where we have to decide which way to go and how to go. The direction is very clear, but the pace of the progress has to increase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chari, providing some clarity on what constitutes Global South and what are prospects of India to lead it. Now I will request Suhasini Haidar to share her thoughts on what are prospects of India fulfilling her aspiration, ambition to be leader of Global South, and how far is necessary for India to have the solid support of USA. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Ambassador Surinder Kumar, particularly because the conversations that he curates often bring out the best in really the Indo-American friendship, which is the sense not only of two democracies, but the sense that we respect diverging views and we respect those who dissent. So permission to dissent from a lot of what has been said so far. When it comes to India's aspirations to become the voice of the Global South, the truth is that this is a historical position for India. So if we are talking about aspirations, it means that somewhere along the way, maybe in the recent past, India lost that ability to be the voice of the Global South, and I think we have to look at it very closely. This is not a political or a polemic sort of argument. This is an argument of where India was, where it was seen as a voice for the voiceless, and then what India became over perhaps the recent decades, where it looked really for that position at the global high table. Some may say there is no choice, that India can be both. It can be the voice of the global south, it can also have its place on the global high table. My case today is simply that that aspiration is going to have to be realized first. That, in other words, that it's not that these two cannot come together, but they can only come in an incremental order. India needs to be that voice before it aspires to become the voice of the global south. I'll tell you why I say this. For the last, as I said, decade or so, as India has walked away and as Ambassador Surinder Kumar said, shrugged off the hesitations of the past, we have seen a kind of shrugging off of positions that India had held. The non-aligned movement, for example, in the last 8 years, it is known to everybody that our Prime Minister has chosen not to attend a single non-aligned forum except for one online. That is speaking with your feet, very much. If we have walked away from non-alignment, have we walked towards alignment? No, we speak about multi-alignment, and I have said, half facetiously, and I've written, that actually we seem to be moving towards something called all alignment. That is, that we are convinced that somewhere there we can be all things to all people, or to paraphrase a very famous American, that we can fool all the people all the time. So we have seen India being able to buy, say, defense platforms from Russia, tech platforms from the US, and absolutely everything else from China. And continue to have these relationships without feeling too strained by them. And I do think that for a while we lived in a sweet spot. Because of what India stood for, because of the fact that India has been in so many different ways engaged with every part of the world, we are seen as a country of formidable qualities, somebody that people do want to align with, or do want to be seen with in that sense. I do think, however, that the position we see ourselves in today and the challenges of the immediate future are going to increase our difficulties at trying to remain in this sweet spot, at trying to remain with this sense of all alignment without necessarily standing in one particular place. To begin with, it is the war in Ukraine. We've already seen the choices that are becoming starker and starker. After that, there was the sort of economic crisis that we have seen. And I'll come to why I say each of them is an issue. There is climate change, where you saw in Sharm el-Sheikh last year a very important intervention being made on behalf of the G77 when it came to climate justice and climate finance. And a commitment came from the developed world to the developing world. Which we will see how it's taken forward this year. It comes to the China threat that India faces more and more on 3 different fronts: at the line of actual control, in the oceans, and in our own neighborhood. And it comes from India's internal relationship with its own democracy. I say this only because Ambassador Surinder Kumar said the days of the CIA hand are in the past, but in the very, very, very recent past, we have heard that, in fact, there is once again a foreign hand that is guiding people inside this country, and that foreign hand is being linked, none other than our External Affairs Minister, to the West, to London and New York, to those capitals. So we are seeing some amount of play between the joints, if you like, when it comes to all of these ideas. I think what all of these challenges are showing us is that India cannot actually be everything to everyone, and can only achieve the leadership it desires if it returns to the center instead of constantly trying to play to the extremes. Why do I say the extremes? Because as we are today on the eve, in fact, as we speak, there is a dinner underway where the G20 foreign ministers are gathering. Later this year, the leaders will arrive. We are actually in a place where the G20 has become the foremost platform for global conversations. Because the G7 is an echo chamber. The NAM is too large and nobody goes to it. we are somewhere in between at the G20. Within the G20, I would say the big powers represent the G9, if you like, the G7 plus Russia and China. So it is this tiny sliver of a majority, if you like, of the G11. So I'm really making up new terms as I go along, that India has to seek the leadership of, has to seek the ability to take along with them, because the G9s are not amenable to India's leadership, shall we say, at the moment. So why did I use each of these? On climate change, India can only bargain for climate justice and demand climate finance if it represents the larger G77 grouping. It missed that opportunity in Sharm el-Sheikh, obviously because the chairmanship was with Pakistan at the time. It can be made up this year in Dubai. Possibly assisting Pakistan during the worst floods, which were a climate change outcome in South Asia, may not have hurt either. On energy and food security, India can claim strategic autonomy, stand in the center, but only if it shows that that autonomy is also there in being able to criticize the actions of Russia, in being able to criticize the actions of a big power that invades its neighbor, its much smaller neighbor, and bombs civilians on a daily basis for a year. It is also only able to take on the challenges of trade and economic distress and pandemics if it is able to focus much more regionally. Why do I say this? Because on one side, we're walking out of RCEP. On the other side, we're walking into this Atmanirbhar policy. What it means is we are having to painstakingly stitch free trade agreements and agreements with each of these developing G9 countries separately. Each of them, first thing they ask for is a mobility agreement, because they want to make sure that while trade is unrestricted, the movement of Indians to these countries does come under some restrictions. And even on terror, we are actually hearing less and less from the Group of Nine. It has much more become a problem of the G11. It is much more a problem for India and South Asia and African nations and Indonesia than it is for any of these countries. On Afghanistan, for example, there seems to be a great unanimity between the G9 when it comes to the rule of the Taliban there. They don't seem to be as bothered by it as India perhaps should be. At the G22, India will need to take all developing countries with it if it is to counter the demands of the G7 on one end and Russia, China on the other. So I humbly disagree that India needs to continuously be a bridge between the east to the west or the south to the west. If it stretches too much, it just becomes a bridge too far. Thank you.
Thank you, Suhasini. You have lived up to your reputation and thrown so many contrary views. Check your Twitter tonight, I hope. Okay, now I turn to my friend Shankar Menon. He needs no prodding what to say. He knows where the world is going, between the order, without order, global south, north, whatever it is. Over to you, Shankar.
Thank you, Surinder. I wish it were true. Let me add to your confusion, because you've heard. Thank you, Suhasini, first for reminding us that we need to have a memory that the world didn't start, 8 years ago or 10 years ago. But I have 3 points to make, and at the end of it, you make what you will of it. I'm sure Shashi Tharoor will make sense of it all. One is, what are we talking about when we say the Global South? The other is, logically, IR tells you that the West and the Global South should be working together in today's world. Then Raja made the case. So why isn't it happening? And lastly, what should we do as India, I think? So what is this Global South? I mean, we've been called all kinds of things. We started being, when I was young, underdeveloped, became developing countries, became third world. Not one of these terms originated among us. Third world was Mao Zedong's term used by Deng, 74. I mean, each one. Now suddenly we're Global South. Global South started as a leftist progressive term about those who were victims of colonialism. Remember? Suddenly it's been washed clean, right? It's no longer. So how do we define this Global South? There's no geography, we've just been told. Is it economic criteria? Do we use What the World Bank tells us, $10,000 to $12,000 per capita is middle income. Anybody below that, part of the global south. Doesn't make sense. A Chinese friend actually asked me today on the phone, so is China part of the global south? And what can you say? I mean, I said to him, depends on how you behave. So if you do what the global south needs, if you use your power for the global south, yeah. I mean, if not, no. He, of course, immediately came back to me and said, you know, we have a debate in China whether India is a regional or a global power. We think it depends on how you behave. So in other words, I told him, behave yourself. He told me, behave yourself. And we left the conversation both saying that we are transitional. We exhibit features of the global south, but we also exhibit features of traditional great powers. And we behave differently. So this is a very complex world that we're in, this world of great power rivalry. But it's not the first time that we've been in a world of great power rivalry. In fact, great power rivalry is intrinsic to any interstate system based on Westphalian states. And we've seen that throughout history. It's just that we had an interval where the West fooled itself into thinking there was no great power rivalry. They also, I mean, they fooled themselves into saying that the Cold War was the long peace. The killing fields were all here in Asia, in the global south. That's why they can talk about, Gaddis can talk about the long peace and how peacefully the Cold War ended. It didn't end peacefully for people in Cambodia, in Korea, in Indochina. You know, on our border, we had 4 wars in less than 25 years. So terms we use, for me, are very important. We need to clarify the way we think about these things. And I'm a bit nervous of using something so vague as the global south. I would much rather use, in an economic context, the underdeveloped countries or the emerging economies, which have achieved something and are now at a different stage of development. But in a political context, I think we have to now start thinking differently. And this is why I say, in a world of great power rivalry like today, which is between orders, and this is important, it's between orders and it's economically globalized. In this situation, you cannot politically talk of the Global South as an organization. There's no room for an online movement. And you see that. You look at all the organizations that have come up in the last decade or a little more than that to deal with this confused world post-global financial crisis. All of them are open-ended and inclusive, whether it's Quad, whether it's RCEP, whether it's CPTPP, each of them is open-ended and inclusive, unlike all the earlier ones during the Cold War, bipolar, or during the unipolar moment. Look at APEC. They're not opening their doors to anybody, not even the economic organizations. Forget about Seattle, CENTO, and so on. So there is today an unaligned sort of nature to this world and to the behavior of these countries that we like to lump together as the Global South. But we're not identical. We have differences among ourselves. So therefore, I say, you need to, what do you do in a world like that? You need to therefore follow a variable geometry in your approach. Different issues will need different alliances, different partners. And it's fairly obvious. If you're talking about maritime security in the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, Maritime Asia, whichever term you prefer, you'll have one set of partners. You do cybersecurity, you'll find another set of partners. Depending on what you're dealing with, you look at Ukraine. Frankly, we, China, have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the military outcome. And there isn't much political space either for the rest of us to get involved. I mean, if we're honest. You look at what pandemic did. It reduced every great power, both in power and in prestige. Every major power. Of course, you can't say this because it makes them all very annoyed. No government will admit that they came out of pandemic weaker than they started it. But the problem is, in this unaligned world which is fragmenting, you have to therefore find ad hoc solutions, deal with it. There isn't an order you can rely on. When was the last coordinated multilateral response to an international crisis, to a transnational issue? Not since April 2009, the London G20, which dealt with the consequences of the global financial crisis and averted another Great Depression. But since then, pandemic, it's a pathetic response. So you can't deal with this as an ordered world or use terms which frankly don't make much sense. And if it were just classical great power rivalry and not a globalized, fragmented, unaligned world, then certainly the West and the Global South are natural allies. They should. And here is a West with tremendous economic superiority, tremendous technological superiority. So why isn't it using it for the benefit of the Global South? Why are over 55 developing countries today, according to the IMF, at grave risk of a debt crisis? Why is it that despite November 2020, the G20 agreeing on what we should do about the developing country debt crisis, nothing has happened? Sri Lanka defaulted last April, still talking, because of great power rivalry, because the West won't give money to pay back debts to China. The Chinese, if they reschedule for Sri Lanka, will have to reschedule across $1 trillion of BRI. Everybody will be there with their hands out asking for a ship. So you're stuck. I mean, the multilateral system, despite all the goodwill in the world in the IMF, is not delivering. And this problem we will have. So why doesn't the West respond? Because I think the one factor that is more important than any of the others that we mention and that we normally talk about is the domestic politics in all these countries. Whether it's China, where you see increasing reliance on nationalism for legitimacy, whether it's the fractured nature of domestic politics in the US, all these, whether it's the nature of our politics, it limits the available options and the ability to bargain, to negotiate, to compromise, which is the essence actually of international relations, of diplomacy. And therefore, the scope for solutions is less. So what should we do? I'm not saying that, oh, you shouldn't therefore express what the Global South needs, because there are transnational issues there which I think really need to be addressed by groups like the G20. And it should be a test of the G20's credibility, whether they actually stand up and do something real or not, rather than just produce communiques in forms of words. And the three big issues, of course, for me, are the debt crisis that I mentioned, climate change, which, I mean, you saw what it did to Pakistan last year. And 1/3 of the country flooded, 1/5 of the population, 1/5 of the country flooded, 1/3 of the population displaced. And economic development. And whatever happened, we used to talk at the beginning of the Doha round, remember? Whatever happened to that? Instead, we're playing great power games and worrying about what happens in Ukraine, which, by the way, has only accelerated trends that we already had. It leaves Europe preoccupied with its internal order, no matter who wins, or if nobody wins. For the foreseeable future, to think of Europe as a geopolitical actor in our part of the world, frankly, it's much diminished. It's not going to be able to. So, for me, looking to great powers, using the balancing, the leverage that may theoretically be available, given their domestic politics, not today. Concentrate on the things that matter, because these are the things that also matter to India. So, for me, therefore, it's a no-brainer. Speak for the Global South, nishkama karma, even if you don't think you're going to achieve very much. But that is the best you can do at this time. I hope I've confused you thoroughly. Thank you.
You have thrown so many ideas to think about, and also Niskam Karma, which has been guiding, I think, lives of all of Indians for ages. Now I turn to Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He has heard patiently to everybody. He can respond to all of them. And I will request also in the end tell how far Global South, in whatever way we define it, can influence global commons or the decision making for global commons. Thank you.
Thank you. As Raja began the evening by saying, we are really an assembly of people who couldn't say no to Surendra Kumar. And one of the things we couldn't say no to was the topics he arbitrarily assigned to each of us, and mine was about global governance. But I have to say that, we speak of global governance the way the Brits speak about the weather. I mean, everyone feels it has to be mentioned, but no one expects anyone to do anything about it. And that's essentially what global governance boils down to. But let me try and challenge it. I would say the voice of the Global South is important at a time in which there are 4 challenges faced by institutions of global governance right now. One is what you would call the challenge of legitimacy. We've been talking about this for some time. The fact that the institutions of global governance all represent the geopolitical and economic realities of 1945 and not of today. The UN Security Council, the IMF. I mean, if you take the Security Council, for example, the Western European group in the UN, which has a grand total of 28 member countries, big and small, always has more than 50% of the Security Council, which is obviously palpably unfair. If you look at the IMF, the combined voting power of the US, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, just 5 countries, is almost 40%, while the combined voting power of 54 African countries is just over 3%. So you can see there is a serious issue of legitimacy right there. Second, there's a crisis of sovereignty. That is that we are talking about countries increasingly asserting their sovereignty. Post-colonial countries certainly feel it's vital to cling on to our sovereignty. On the other hand, you've got countries in Europe and so on, even in Africa, who believe that they need to cede a bit of sovereignty in order to gain collective benefits, including bargaining power in international bodies. There's also, thirdly, a crisis of the collective, by which I mean that we do have attempts to get countries together in collectivities. Various alphabet soups have been concocted, and indeed, Suhasini just gave us a few today from G7, 8, 9, 10, 11, a whole lot, anything but 20. But simultaneously, many of these nations are at odds with each other bilaterally. And if you look at the G20 itself, for example, the failure of the finance ministers to agree a joint communique a couple of days ago is itself an example of the fact that there is no collective agreement even within these existing collectivities. And the fourth would be what one might call a crisis of identity. We saw it in the backlash against globalization that has characterized a lot of the period from roughly 2008 to today, where you've seen, first of all, an economic backlash in the developed world against their jobs being shanghaied literally, and people resenting the fact that the economic elites in their countries seem to be working to the benefit of other countries elsewhere rather than of themselves. But you also had a cultural backlash in which you saw not only people resenting immigration, cosmopolitanism, and all of that, but you also saw the rise of nationalism across the world in many countries in the name of the argument that these nationalist leaders were more authentic representatives of their societies and their people than the ruthless globalists and cosmopolitans whom they were supplanting. We've seen that everywhere, from Britain's Brexit to America's voting in Trump to Turkey's celebration of Erdogan, and arguably similar arguments were used by Mr. Modi in India. And this reassertion, of course, there's an interesting theory by the British writer David Goodhart, that the world is essentially in a battle between the somewheres and the anywheres. The somewheres, I beg your pardon, the anywheres are the people who are comfortable anywhere in the world. They flit from 5-star hotel to business class lounge, and they can speak in global conferences and so on, and have discussions like this one. The somewheres are people who are rooted in one particular spot, who are firmly anchored in one religion, one ethnicity, often speak only one language, and at the same time see themselves as being from one place. And those are the kinds of people, for example, whom Trump voted, whose votes Trump solicited and won, and is going to seek again. And those are the kinds of people who, in Goodhart's formulation, were winning this battle globally. Now, obviously, there's a pushback as well. Trump has lost. Bolsonaro in Brazil has lost. Many who rose on this kind of message, from Germany to Austria to Denmark and to France, went high, but only ended up second in their countries, never ended up coming to power. So you can argue there's a pushback. In fact, there's a wonderful thing going around WhatsApp today, of a photograph of a meeting in London between Rishi Sunak and Kamala Harris with the US and the American flags behind them. The American and the UK flags behind them. And the comment going around on WhatsApp is, "Jhande aapke hain, bande hamare hain." So what is identity in these contexts, we'll have to see. But the fact is that these are the four broad crises, and I would say that as a result of these crises, global governance and global governance institutions are definitely being questioned fundamentally, and all the efforts made to set up these institutions at the end of the Second World War to foster international cooperation, to elaborate consensual global norms, and to establish predictable, universally applicable rules for the benefit of all. That conception has now been frayed, not just at the edges, but really all over by these four crises. And increasingly, as we look around the world today, we can't note first of all, we can't help but notice the large number of new powers that have come into being since the structures of the international system were put in place in 1945, and that the emerging powers, as Seshadri Chari pointed out, have moved very much from the periphery to the center of global governance concerns and discourse, and they have a legitimate and increasingly voluble desire to share power and responsibility in the global system. So that's the issue here. Can the Global South, and India speaking as a major voice of it, help work towards a redesign of global governance to ensure that the countries that have so far been excluded and marginalized can participate in a manner commensurate with their capacity? Because let's face it, with all these global institutions, all this New World Order, all this talk, it's a high table, and you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And essentially what's happened is that more and more countries have had enough of being on the menu and want to claim a seat at the table. So when Raja says at the beginning that the era of multilateralism is over, clearly what we are looking for is a more inclusive multilateralism, perhaps inaugurating a new era there. And I agree with Shankar Menon's definitions of how Global South emerged. It was a more polite way than saying third world, which was a very American view. The first world was them, the second world were the commies, and the third world were the rest. I mean, that was how the Americans came up with that term, I think, and used it anyway. And obviously Global South is better. Prime Minister Modi, and I don't quote him very often, as you know, but let me quote his speech at the Voices for the Global South Summit in January this year. He said, "We, the Global South, have the largest stakes in the future. 3/4 of humanity lives in our countries. We should also have equivalent voice. Hence, as the 8-decade-old model of global governance slowly changes, we should try to shape the emerging order." That's as explicit a statement of purpose as you can possibly get. Now, he went on with his fondness for alliteration and said he wants to re-energize the world with a global agenda of respond, recognize, respect, and reform. Respond to the priorities of the Global South, recognize the principle of common and differentiated responsibilities, respect sovereignty of all nations and rule of law and so on, and reform international institutions, including the UN. And I suppose Jayashankar's foreign minister's statement that India can play a stabilizing and bridging role emerges from the same sort of concept. And Jay went on to say, we have to really see in economic terms, how can we contribute to the de-risking of the global economy? How in political terms can we help depolarize the world? So that, if you like, adds to the task that the Prime Minister has set India as being the voice of the Global South. And Raja suggesting that this could be the construction of a bridge between the South and the West is a perfectly legitimate analysis, but is it enough is a real question. In fact, in 2012, when I wrote my book, Pax Indica, India and the World in the 21st Century, I advanced the idea then that India had a critical role to play in what had already begun to become by then a cooperative network system in our multipolar world. That is, I was seeing us at the center in some ways of, or at least having a crucial role in shaping an emerging global network which would help define international relations in the 21st century. Of course, the old binaries of the Cold War are no longer relevant. No one really says non-alignment answers any meaningful questions anymore. We are living at the same time in a world in which one defining paradigm is impossible for us. I agree with Raja that we can't simply be non-aligned between two superpowers when one of them sits on our borders and nibbles at our own territory. But nor can we afford to sacrifice our strategic autonomy in a quest for self-protection. So we need to define a new rule for ourselves. And that depends on how we understand and see the world, which is where all the points made by the four speakers, I think, remain completely valid. And I must say, Suhasini, it was I who will immodestly claim credit for having inflicted multi-alignment as a term here. I used it first in 2009 as MOS, and it sank without trace. I think Shiv Shankar Menon, as Foreign Secretary, gave one disapproving look and never again was it used by anyone in the ministry. But now Jay himself is using it, and he was gracious enough at the Raisina dialogue last year to attribute it to me. But it's a phrase that I think serves to summarize the kind of approaches we have today, where we can be, we're the only country that can be with both the Russians and the Chinese and RIC. We can add the Brazilians and South Africans and have BRICS. Then we can kick out the Russians and Chinese and we have IPSA for South-South collaboration. Or we can leave out the Russians but include the Chinese and have BASIC for environmental negotiations. We are relevant to all of these, not only because our country's name begins with that most useful element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because we actually have something to contribute in all these formulations. And I think that when Shankar Menon at the end of his remarks was sort of summarizing what he referred to, I think it almost came out as speak for the global south, but act for yourself. And that ultimately is probably what every country would need to do, because obviously we, to a great extent, can take our sovereignty for granted. We know no one is going to threaten it now. But we do have to definitely play a more significant role in the making of global rules. This whole line, I think Raja came up with it first, that we've been a rule taker for a long time. We now should start being a rule maker. And I think this is very clear that this is something which we can do. And doing it in the context of bridging is probably as useful a paradigm as any other we've advanced this evening. So the evolution of this role would be well worth watching. Just under your 10 minutes? No second bell? Thank you.
Thank you, Shashi. Tell me, what is cooking? In 10 minutes' time, you have quoted Prime Minister Modi and Dr. Jaishankar in 10 minutes this evening. What is cooking? I think next session Parliament I think the next session Parliament will be much more peaceful and you can have some kind of constructive discussion in the Parliament. Well, friends, give a big hand to our panelists. It has very stimulating discussion, and thanks to the president, they say, I don't take no, but I don't take no because if I don't have them, I won't have you. You are here because of them, so big hand to you all. Now, we have about 20 minutes to question answers. I think I will first my prerogative to really prompt some. I know, Mr. Bhagat, I will really certainly get you. I think the Director General of IDSA has been patiently listening for the last 1 hour. I think, do you have a question? Please give mic to Dr. Ambassador Sujanshu. I will come to you. Sujanshu now first. Please give a mic here.
Can I?
No, please, first question, I am telling you, I will just invite you.
Thank you very much. I am not quite sure why you roped me in, but let me reflect by way of a question on what Raja had said. I think the global south is being wooed, you suggested. It was wooed in the past during the Cold War. It's being wooed today. But the wooing is very different, and I think the absence of a binary choice in the past makes it very different from the presence of a binary choice today. And the latter is in fact proving to be somewhat insidious in terms of its impact on domestic politics. So I think during the Cold War, it was very clear that the global south would have chosen one side and technically stuck with that. But today, the global south is affected much more by the binary choices being provided. And Penny, for your thoughts on that.
Briefly, I mean, look, I think it depends on your position in the system. If you have capacity to bargain, you can bargain. If you say it as a pressure point to choose either side, then it's a problem. But if you have the leverage,
I'm sorry, I didn't make myself clear enough. I meant the impact, the insidious impact on domestic politics as a result of a binary choice. Take Nepal, for example. After a great deal of internal discourse, the Americans managed to get the Millennium Challenge Corporation to declare a loan of, say, $500 million. And it has created a great deal of problems within Nepalese politics. So this binary choice wasn't there during the Cold War. You might have had parts of Africa, Mozambique and others, several going with the Russians and the Chinese, some that went, being part of the Third World, went with the Americans. But today you have this real problem.
Okay, let him come in.
look, I mean, it's not that everybody got stuck with one side. Egypt switched sides in a dramatic way. Our Pakistani friends bridged, the supposed joint anti-communist alliances, made a deal with China right there. So I think it depends your bargaining capacity and your location, where you can play it. Look, I think in terms of domestic politics, those, again, as strong governments can manage it. I don't think Nepal government has collapsed because of the MCG. I mean, I think they're quite happy if somebody gives them money, and that too free money. And as far as India is concerned, I mean, it connects the infrastructure between Nepal and India. So I don't think that is the dominant play. It is my understanding in Nepal. So I don't see it being a problem, but my sense is today, tomorrow, there is a contestation today for rare earths. If you have rare earths, and today in large parts is the Chinese who have moved in first. If this other side offers me a rival bid, thank you. The two suitors are better than one suitor. I think that is what has changed, because I said the West has neglected the Third World all these years, saying we don't need anybody else. And I think the unipolar movement made them lazy, but today I think they're going to contest in every corner from the Indo-Pacific, from the South Pacific Islands to Latin America. Chinese competition is going to discipline the United States. It's going to compel them to respond. We saw yesterday Blinken, before coming here, he's in Central Asia, right in the heart of the Soviet sphere of influence, Russian sphere of influence. So I think the competition is going to be all expansive. And I am saying, for large developing countries, thank you. The rivalry can be leveraged for my own benefit. And I think that is the shift that is possible today, rather than merely objecting to great power rivalry. You have no way of limiting it. Is the only way can we manage it, use it for our own benefit, I think is the question.
Anyone of you want to add? Okay, now we move to Mr. Vagai. Please give mic to him.
For Dr. Chari, the Chinese have not fired a single shot for the last 50 years over the border. On the other hand, are we in danger of falling into the lap of the Pentagon because they seem to determine America's foreign policy? I mean, look what Biden has done. He's given jets to Pakistan instead of helping them in some way, versus Trump, who exposed them completely. So basically, this is my question.
In fact, that's the reason why I said that one of the biggest challenge for India would be to avoid getting drawn into this vortex of new power contestation. The power contestation is no longer based on the military strength of the countries. It's no longer based on the colonies. It's purely going to be economic. So you will have to make a choice someday or the other. But then when you make a choice, can you really protect your, what is often quoted as maintaining your own strategic autonomy, and at the same time looking after the national interest and keeping it on top of the priority list. So this is going to be a challenge, but I think from what we have done so far, as far as balancing, we have been far better in balancing between the superpowers and between the so-called powers, in fact, than any other time. So I think that kind of a political will and also the political maneuvering capability is always there. But what we have to be very importantly looking at is, one, the economic independence, two, the technological improvements that we have to make, and also not miss the bus as far as Industry 4.0 is concerned. So these are going to be the points that are going to determine our relationship with the West, the developed North, and if we can become an effective bridge between North and South.
Radha, you want to add anything? Suhasini, you want to add anything?
Well, not really, except that I do think that power is also something we need to start discussing. We need to discuss what we mean by power. Is power the power of the military, the economics, the the technological power? Because there'll always be different kinds of power. Is it the power of persuasion? After all, the person who wrote about soft power, Joseph Nye, said it isn't about whose army wins. It is about whose story wins. And I think that's the power that India is best placed to grab and perhaps have control of. That's it.
Professor Chintamani Mahapatra.
Thank you, sir. This is a question to the panel. In the West now, there is a demand for deglobalization because they did not benefit from the current globalization. Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister have often spoken about shaping a globalization that should be human-centric and not centralized, that should be global sensitive. So what can India do to promote such an idea?
I think all of you can comment. We start from Dr. Tharoor. What is your question?
I don't think one can sit here and come up immediately with a policy prescription. I think the intention is, there are some aspects of globalization that we all recognize we need. Certainly India is far more integrated into the global economy since the advent of globalization than we ever were before. And we can't, and it's not in our interest to unravel all of that. At the same time, when the Prime Minister popped up with Atmanirbharta, I think it was a reflection of the fact that some of that globalization implied a dependence and a loss of control over things like, for example, the sourcing of certain essential supplies for our country. Even pharmaceuticals, because COVID had happened, that's when we realized it. Pharmaceuticals or the ingredients that go into making them were coming overwhelmingly from China, and we had allowed ourselves to be in a position of dependency. So I think the idea was preserve globalization where it suits your interests, but push back against it when it involves making you so dependent that you could be vulnerable in a crisis in the future. That would be my answer to your question. But I mean, it's obviously easier to say this than to implement it across the board in every issue, but that's the way forward.
Shankar, you want to chip in?
Well, I think the question is, how do you shape the system, right? If you want to shape the system, you must have power. You can't do it without the power. But, and here I think what Suhasini said makes sense. Power is not fungible. You can't use an atom bomb to kill a mosquito. It will probably work, but it does other things at the same time which you don't want happening. So you have to deal with, you need different kinds of power. You need comprehensive national power. And until you build that up, the rest is aspiration. And people might like your statements and people will support you and so on, but the system isn't going to change until you actually acquire that power.
Dr. Chari?
I mean, nothing new to add as such, but yes, I mean, we have had the kind of atmosphere where we always took pride that we are one of the proponents of soft power. So, but I think it's not going to be the only narrative that's going to bring out an answer, as others also pointed out. We are in a very challenging situation. And the dynamics of geopolitics does not allow you to be wedded to one principle. So when when it comes to the question of national interest, you have to give up principles for the sake of pragmatism. And this is not the first time that we have been doing this. In fact, for the first time, when the idea of principle was set aside and pragmatism was chosen, and a new narrative of pragmatic power was built by none other than Mrs. Indira Gandhi in 1971. Nobody expected that India will also be a hard power, but which we proved it. So you don't have to have philosophical or principled cocoon and sit into it and get wedded to it. One has to be very pragmatic in their approach, and I think we have been quite pragmatic in the last 2 decades. So I think we will have to study the challenges and come up with an answer that fits the bill at the time of that challenge. And it may remain a challenge for some time, it may not remain a challenge for some time. So the solutions always differ. So we can have broad parameters as far as solutions are concerned, but at the micro level, we cannot predict and we cannot bind the hands of the future generation with what we think is right today.
Sir, just give me 30 seconds. If the government of India is proposing Arogya Maitri after Vaccine Maitri, if the government of India is proposing setting up a center in India to train different kind of skill to the global south people, then he talks about science and technology, sharing the digital achievements. Are these going to really help in, having a global south sensitive globalization?
I think these are really helping. The kind of UPI payment schedules that we have been signing with different countries of the world. So almost every fortnight we are adding a new country as far as UPI is concerned. I was also part of the team which went to Middle East and tried to sell this idea. A number of African countries are showing interest in all these things. In fact, Africa is one place which is really looking at India for a number of solutions. They don't want a Chinese prescription. They want an Indian prescription. They want Indian solutions. They are prepared to accept it, and that is also because we are ready to respect their sovereignty. We don't want to exploit their resources, but we want to be partners with them. So we no longer call it aid, we call it developmental partnership. So this kind of attitude, which is also part of the soft power diplomacy, which we are doing it. So I think we are on the right track, but of course, as Shiv Shankar Menon pointed out, we need the economic strength, and technology is what is going to give you the economic strength. That is where we will have to do much more homework.
Thank you. Suhasini, you have 1 minute. We wind up in 1 minute.
Sure. Very quickly, when you talk about human-centric growth and cooperation, I think we're in the best place because as of this year, we have the most amount of humans in our country. But I think that we can actually broaden the idea a little more because as much as India stands for many things in the world, and I think India's unique perspective is that it is the largest such population, the largest such demography in the world that is a pluralistic, inclusive democracy. If India fails to be pluralistic or inclusive or a democracy, I can assure you we will not have that force multiplier. We will not have that USP. And I think we can increase it by looking much more at our neighborhood. If today we are looking at climate change and pollution problems, can we really fix air pollution by just doing India and not Pakistan and not Bangladesh? We have to manage airsheds. If we are looking at oil consumption and we are all the greatest oil-needy countries, can we not become an oil cartel and negotiate together? If we send 8 million Indians to the Gulf just alone and Indians to all parts of the world, don't Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal do that as well? Why can't we negotiate terms for South Asians around the world? Better labor, better wages and all the rest of that, better labor standards. So I do feel that it is necessary to work on this. If it is our strength, then make it our strength in negotiations and not negotiate in a race that everyone else is already in ahead of us.
Thank you very much for bringing such wonderful audience. Give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you all.